Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of The Lion's Den. I'm so excited for this episode. I have the privilege of having Norwich City Football Club's chief reporter Connor Southwell to discuss football and the media and how he entered the world of journalism. So, how's the world of football been recently in the eyes of a journalist?
Well, from a Norwich City perspective, not great. They've just been relegated, so that's presented some kind of challenges from a professional perspective in terms of a relationship with the football club, and maybe writing criticism is slightly different in terms of how that's perceived by people. So, from a professional perspective, it's been a little bit difficult. Generally, I think media and football's in a really interesting place because I think what you're trying to get to, or what people and outlets are trying to get to at the moment, and it's kind of where my organisation is trying to head as well, is kind of an idea of getting consumers to pay for news, which is
quite controversial.
Controversial, but also a real change from maybe what people would expect from news, where you can ordinarily go on BBC News' website, for example, and get loads of stuff free. And you could do on our websites before. So you're asking people to make a significant change to the way they consume content as well, and with that comes extra challenges. So I'd say it's in a really interesting place, both individually but also kind of more generally, football and media and the relationship.
Do you think it's harder writing about the club when they do worse, or do you prefer it? Do you find it easier when it's better because you can just be obviously so good?
Well, I mean, I've kind of had both ends, because the year before they got promotion and won the league and were very good, and then the year after they got relegated. So in my 3 years I've had 2 relegations and a promotion. So it's either
up and down all the time,
it's usually very bad or very good. And actually, from my experience, it's usually easier to be critical than it is to be uber positive. Maybe that says more about me than the person. I'm sure everyone has a different answer to that, but that's kind of my experience from it so far. But obviously, I have had to write sort of more criticism than I have positivity.
Recently,
so maybe that sort of adds to my answer, or makes my answer that certain way.
Yeah, that's fine. When you first came to give the career tour, it was quite amazing to see the journey and how experience has kind of driven your journey instead of like qualifications. So for me, obviously I've been told my whole life, like, go to university, get a degree, that's how you're going to get into it otherwise. But for those who don't know, obviously, your story, how did you get into journalism?
Yeah, really, really interesting, because I sit here as someone who works professionally as a journalist who doesn't actually have any qualifications to be a journalist, which is quite a unique position to be in. And I mean, I'm incredibly fortunate for that, first and foremost. But you're right in what you said. A lot of what I did was kind of experience-based and trying to do stuff off my own back. So it initially started with kind of a blog that I did myself, which was very bad. That was basically like an English essay, but it was for me kind of a start, and it feels to me, and I enjoyed doing it as well. And I think those are the two important things right at the start of it: to enjoy it, but also to learn that you're bad at it and why you're bad at it, and where you need to improve. So that was probably an important step. And then I moved into kind of more of a fan media sphere, which is again, we spoke about the football and media kind of link and the relationship and what it's like at the moment. That kind of feels like something that's growing in the football world. You kind of have more fan sites that are becoming more professional. So I was probably fortunate that I was doing it at a time where fan sites were getting more access to players and becoming a bit more professional. So there was one interview I did in particular with Norwich City sporting director, who's basically the guy who's in charge of their football operations day to day. So kind of the big boss of it, that would never have happened if I'd have done it 5 years ago. So there's been a little bit of luck along the way, and then through that I got the opportunity, and I did do 1 year at university at the UEA studying media, and then 1 year in got offered this job because as we've spoken about, I managed to build up an experience base. And I feel like when so many people are now trying to get qualifications in certain things, and this was my outlook at the time, you almost have to have something that's slightly different or separates yourself.
You have to have like USB or
exactly.
Something like
so mine was almost, okay, I'm going to try and get these qualifications, but I'm also going to build up like a bed of experience that people can look at and say, okay, so he qualified, but unlike maybe these people who have the same qualification, he's done X, Y, and Z that puts him ahead for a job, was kind of my thinking. And in the end, it turned out I didn't need the qualification bit. So you can plan a route all you like, but sometimes you cut corners, or things change, or opportunities arise that you didn't expect. And that was the case for me. And it's not the case for everyone. It's not kind of a one shoe fits all. But like you, it was I was exactly the same. It was always, you have to get these qualifications.
Yeah,
you
exactly.
have to do GCSEs, you have to do A levels, you have to go to uni. There was a pathway.
Yeah.
And then once you left uni, you can get a job. And actually, I've found that it's not like that.
Exactly.
It's not as simple as that, and you don't always need all the steps.
No.
And it started for me kind of looking right at the end and going,
Okay.
what have people in that position done, and what does it look like, and kind of working way
backwards,
back, rather than kind of going, right, I'm here, how do I get there? It was, how did they get here to where I am?
Yeah.
And then sort of looking at all the steps and all the pathways. So that's kind of my route into it. So slightly unusual and not particularly qualifications based, which is quite unique.
Yeah, but it kind of shows that it's kind of sometimes better to get your foot in the door and gain that experience rather than, because for me, I was always like, oh, if I want to be a journalist, then it's just writing. And then I'm actually like, oh wait, no, I can do spoken, I can do podcasts, I can do presenting. Don't think I'd do that good presenting face to face because I've got quite expressive face. But was it always you wanted to be a journalist, or have you always?
No, I think
didn't have a clue.
See, I think deep down, I studied drama, so I did drama at GCSEs. I did drama at A level, so I've probably got like what I refer to as the like look at me gene, which I think a lot of people in kind of either creative fields or journalism have, where they like attention and they like to be looked at, which is quite a contrast with what I'm like as a person. I'm quite reserved and I don't really give a lot away about a lot of stuff, but I think I probably had that. So initially for me it was always very much like I want to be on TV. I didn't know what I looked like, but I wanted to be on TV. And it was only really when I started writing my blog that I thought quite like writing. And in the background obviously kind of had this ambition for TV as well. And then, as I said, in that process where I was kind of looking at journeys and plotting them, and you look at what the role that I have now, for example, which was a dream role, was kind of the role I looked at the time, thought that's where I'd like to be. When you look at it, actually it's not just writing, it's podcasts and it's video, and there's lots of different strands to it. So for me it was kind of about making myself as competent in those 3 fields or 4 fields or however many fields there are in that specific thing, and trying to get experience in all of them. And I got told very early on by someone who is a professional journalist, don't close doors, keep as many doors open as you can for as long as possible. Because then almost you don't have to worry, and because I think if you close off loads of stuff and you go down one route,
very restricted.
You could narrow down a pool of 30 jobs to a pool of 3 jobs, and so you limit your chances of getting into what is already a very competitive field. So if you can be maybe outstanding in 1 or very good in 3, I'd say try and be very good in 3.
But for me, I've never, like, obviously I'm set on journalism now, but I never was. Like, I remember I've gone through scientist, vet, like the most random thing ever. But for me, I've always liked like creative stuff. Like I always did art and I liked that. But people always call like art a very risky industry to go into, which obviously is quite controversial and stuff. And then like I enjoy like cooking and sport, but I was like, oh, I kind of want to keep that as a hobby. But then like I went to Media City when I was like 12 or 13. And then I just kind of like loved it. Like we went to obviously the BBC's host there, and there's ITV, and there's everything. It's just all in one place. And I was like, actually, it's like giving a voice to someone who feels silenced, because I think that's what I wanted to pursue. And it's kind of like, I always feel like the news is very negative now. Like you open it, and I was talking to my mum yesterday, and I said to her, oh, have you heard about this? She was like, no, I haven't really looked at the news, because like sometimes people are a bit like, oh, I don't want to hear about more disaster and stuff. So for me, it's kind of like, I want to bring a positive outlook on it and like give a voice to those who, like, because it's the same for me. If people look to me, they're like, she's not confident at all, she doesn't want to talk and stuff. And that's why when I was like, yeah, I'm going to be on the radio and stuff, they were like, hang on, what? Like, you would never have done that. And I think it's just like gaining that confidence. I think first of all for me was when I first got my first job. I was just a waitress at just a little farm shop, and it may seem like nothing, but you're talking to people of all ages and stuff, and it's actually making you realise just to go out. But I think journalism is quite underrated with the power, like obviously because it influences our lives and changes attitudes. So obviously you keep up to date with what's going on in the world and like widens what needs to be solved. So how would you sum up the power of like journalism and the media?
Yeah, very, very powerful. And I know there's we're going to talk about it later on about kind of why it's so important and stuff like that. But I think it's and maybe kind of what it looks like in society more, and why society needs journalism probably more widely. But for me, it's incredibly powerful, and I know even in the job that I do, which in the grand scheme of things isn't important, football's not important. I'm fully aware of that compared to obviously the stuff that's going on kind of in Europe and around the world, and the various conflicts and the various issues that we have. Football is nothing really. But even I know that I can write a story that can alter opinions or shape a way that a debate is looked at, and for me that's not something that I take lightly. Sometimes it can be like an unnecessary burden at times, because it means a lot of the time you're kind of thinking, and this is what I try and do with stories a lot, particularly if I'm writing something sort of opinion based. I always try and consider both sides, and I always try and counter myself in my own head, because I know that if I put something out there that it's just going to get crucified.
There could be some backlash.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
But also it can, so for example, if there's a 19-year-old, for example, who's playing for Norwich City, and I go, I don't think they're very good. And not that anyone should listen to me at all, because they shouldn't. But that could influence a certain amount of people and shape their opinions, and that in effect could have then shape his career and what it looks like and his confidence on the pitch. So I'm all too aware for it, and this is on a level that, as I said, is not important. So when you kind of reporting on stuff that's massive and breaking massive exclusive stories and the impact that they can have on people, not just the audience but also the people involved in them, I think is really significant. So it's a very powerful thing, but also I think quite an underrated thing as well, because sometimes that power is really important, and as you said, it gives voices to people who need to have voices, or it exposes stuff that needs to be exposed. Or it uncovers facts that need to be in the public domain. So that power, I think, ultimately is a good thing, but you have to be really careful with it.
I feel like you have to, if you're like writing an argument or opinion, you have to know both sides, because obviously if you went in there and was like, this needs to be changed, this bit's bad about football, the backlash and stuff, it could be quite bad. But even though you say football isn't, but obviously it's not as bad as like what's happening in the world and stuff, but it does shape, like Britain is very football heavy. Like most people do support a team, and even though like I don't know anything about football in comparison to you and stuff, I still know about football. Case of like when it was like World War I or II, when like Germany and Britain had the football match, it still shows the power of a sport to bring people together. But it's still like showing what's where in the past, and it's influenced the present day. But for me, quite a strong feminist, but it's quite how they've influenced over time. So like obviously the suffragettes, and then the protests recently because of like the Roe versus Wade, which is quite an up-to-date issue. And it's been quite powerful in showing how different people have taken it, and how like obviously it's all been interpreted differently in the news, because obviously you've got like the controversy around like Putin. I was talking about someone the other day about like obviously in Russia the propaganda, everyone like adores him, but then you look in the Western world and he's seen as a Hitler or something. So it's kind of like seeing how the media presents it, and that also relates to like the controversy of fake news, so people can distrust the media sometimes because of they're not sure. But for what aspects do you think of history has had the greatest influence on journalism today, and has anything inspired you from the past?
That's a good question. I actually think kind of in terms of inspired me, and I still do this now. I always try and read people who are better than me, and I think we're quite privileged in this country at the moment that there's a lot of very talented sports writers at a national level, and football's in a really interesting place because suddenly we've got English football players who play for the national team speaking about political issues or societal issues. Marcus Rashford is probably the most prominent example. So you've now got football writers reflecting that and writing about issues that are linked to football but beyond football. And some of them, Jonathan Liu is a brilliant one who writes for The Guardian, not specifically on football, but writes on other stuff. So not historical figures as much, but
still
certainly figures in the field who I've taken inspiration from on my own sort of journey and still do now. And it's kind of people come to me for advice and say, what do I need to do? And one of the top answers, and I've probably given you the same thing, is always try and read people who are better than you, or watch people who are better than you, because then you can take bits, and that's kind of what I've done. So whilst not like a massive historical figure, I think there are certainly people that I've looked at within the industry that I'm in, and kind of used them for inspiration. I've also I also like kind of old football managers. So Brian Clough is a good example, who are kind of personalities, and because I think we're in a world, and I see it a lot because I interview footballers a lot, and I completely understand why this is the case, but a lot of them are media trained, and so you can ask them a question and sometimes you can feel like you've not really got the answer that you would get if you were speaking to them like we're sitting now and sitting and speaking. So I kind of look for people who aren't like that, and there are some footballers now who aren't like that, but he's a really interesting example because he was managing very successfully in the 70s, the 80s, and was talking about politics and was picking out issues with the game. It was quite controversial actually, and I don't necessarily agree with everything he said either, but I actually think that's quite refreshing. I think that we when we talk about historical figures now, it's like we have to agree with all of the aspects of what they said forever. But actually, I think the art of disagreeing is really important. And particularly as a human being looking inward, if you can find things you disagree with, sometimes that's more powerful than stuff you agree with. So sometimes I try and look for people that I disagree with and read people that I disagree with as well for inspiration. So I kind of take inspiration from a lot of places, both kind of people who are in journalism and people who aren't, and some of that is just for me as a human being as well. It's not necessarily for me as a writer or a journalist or whatever. So I lean on it, but there's no one that I would pinpoint and say absolutely them.
But I think for also disagreeing can kind of motivate you in a way to show your own viewpoint, because obviously if you agree with everything then nothing is going to change. But I do think there is quite a controversy kind of around footballers in the fact that they earn lots of money and they live in these big houses, whereas like the power that like you have and stuff, you can show a different perspective, and obviously they are quite media trained because they have to be aware of like the backlash they could get if they say one wrong thing in the media. That can completely erupt in the wrong way, and obviously because they are a role model for so many people that they have to be showing the right things. And obviously I think Marcus Rashford is obviously a very good inspiration to many because he's showing that he's still aware of his background and he's aware of where he's came from and how that's influenced like him today, because obviously there needs to be aware of what's happened before. But this is quite a controversial question, but do you believe like the issue of gender inequality exists in journalism and in sport, and is it easier for men to make an influence? Because obviously like male football is so much more present in the media than women's football.
Absolutely. I can give you an example. Every week I go to a stadium and I walk into a press room, and as soon as that door opens or you walk into it, you see an absolute sea of white, probably straight for a lot of the time, probably straight males, and that's a problem really, and I've often felt quite uncomfortable. I've been in this job now, this is be 3 years in September, and it's almost made me quite uncomfortable. The lack of female voices are in there, and also it's not just sort of female voices either, it's ethnic minorities as well. You don't see too many of those in a press room, and that's a problem in terms of the sort of diversification of football coverage generally, and I think it's kind of getting balanced out a bit more probably on TV than it is in written media a lot more, because you turn on your TV screen now and there's some excellent female presenters. Laura Woods is very good, she's on the radio and the TV. Alex Scott, who doesn't rescue football, but she's excellent. Claire Balding, Gabby Logan, we can list loads, and likewise for kind of ethnic minority presenters as well. So I think it's more of a problem for written media, and that's one that we need to address. And I know, for example, to give you a sort of very real and very kind of personal story on this, we had a vacancy in our team a few months ago for a Norwich City reporter, so someone to join our team, and there's three of us, so me and two others, and we didn't get a single female applicant. And so this is a conversation that we need to have more generally, I think, in media about why that is, and why women aren't coming forward and applying for these jobs, or why they're not getting these jobs. So definitely there's an inequality. I see it every week in every press box up and down the country that I go in. And it is something that needs to be addressed, because there's some brilliant female writers and presenters, and there's some brilliant ethnic minority ones as well. So it's something that needs to change, and I hope that it will change, and I hope it will change soon. because I think football generally, as you touched upon, has just a culture of very white, very heterosexual, very male
dominant.
and that's a shame, because I think then it impacts the sort of coverage that he gets, and the kind of perspective that he gets as well, and also the females who are involved, just as a final point very quickly, seem to get more criticism. So there'll be female analysts or pundits or whatever who will say a certain thing, and it will be like their opinion is not valid for the reason that they are a woman, which is ridiculous. And there's some wonderful campaigns now. There's a campaign called Her Game Too, which was set up by female football fans, which is brilliant and does lots of brilliant work. And interestingly enough, I know there's been lots of conversations between fan groups of Norwich City and supporters groups of Norwich City and the football club to try and become an official partnership of that. And at the moment, the football club aren't, and lots of people criticise that. Lots of football clubs are signed up to it, so it's probably a problem in football more widely, but absolutely there's a problem of inequality that needs to be addressed.
But I feel like it's like having the importance of like having to increase that like diversity, because women like obviously historically have been silent, so it's the fear of like actually wanting to break that, and like once obviously we do, and like women are more represented and they will want it more, but it's just that initial starting of it.
And I think it's about creating an environment as well. So I mean, I used to go, when I had a season ticket and was a fan, I used to go with my sister, and I remember being stood on an away terrace supporting Norwich City, and there was a female linesman, and there was my sister, and there was a couple of others of females in the row who we didn't know, and there was a comment from a guy probably a couple of rows around, sort of moaning at this official, basically along the lines of, because she was female she didn't get the decision right. I think she did get the decision right, but that's not the point. But I remember then a very frank exchange, as it should be, called out. And it's like, actually we need to create an environment first for people, and for women in particular, to feel comfortable in football grounds. And I think once you address the environment within football grounds, that's then you're going to create more fans, then you're going to create more journalists, then you're going to create people who have more interest in it. And that's kind of how I see it. But certainly with kind of the female game, and obviously there's the Euros this summer. It feels like that's massive. That's in this country for the first time. So I think there's going to be a lot of coverage of women's football, which is excellent, and that's certainly something that people are seeing a lot more value in. So I feel like we're getting there. We're probably just not getting there quick enough.
It's just creating an environment where women feel like their voice will be listened. Because if they feel like they're welcomed and they actually feel comfortable, like for me, like if I walked into a press room and it was all full of men, I would feel a bit intimidated, because it'd be like I wouldn't know what to say and stuff. But as long as we create that environment which is welcoming, then it will become more easier for women to feel like they can be listened to, and it will become easier. But obviously that's going to be down to the power of the media, and I've touched upon this a little, but why do you think the issue of like fake news has arisen, and do you think this has like affected the trust in journalists?
Definitely. So again, very personal story to me, and I remember for a long time I was very uncomfortable with the word journalist. People would ask me what I do, or they come up and say, "Oh, you're a journalist," and I didn't want to be kind of labelled with that, because and part of it is because of the qualification stuff that we felt like I've never really kind of looked at myself and felt like I'm a journalist, because that to me felt like someone who's qualified, and you have to have qualifications to be a journalist, and that's not the case. And I'm a bit more at ease with it now. But I always used to say, no, I'm just a reporter, was kind of the term.
Something else,
because sometimes you would get people that would kind of, you're a journalist. Or you get the typical kind of conversations where people would joke and say, don't write any of this down when you speak, and stuff like that, which, they think is funny, but, at times it's a bit like, well, I'm a human being as well, So I had an issue with that term for a little while because of people's lack of trust in them, and it's probably affected me because I know that if I write a story, and sometimes you write stuff which is based on sourcing and trusting people and trying to find stuff out, you have to make sure you're right, and I think that's crucial, because ultimately I think that's why everyone's in this profession and in this job, because they want to tell news stories that are accurate. If you're in it to spread lies, you're in it for the right reason, are you? And let's be honest, plenty of people are, because if you do that and you're sensationalist, you get attention. And it comes back to what we spoke about before. Some people are just in it for that look at me gene.
Attention,
and you can forge a very successful career from doing that as well, and that is probably a pitfall of the industry that we're in. But for me, particularly with football, I know that if I'm going to put something out, I want to be 100% certain that that's right. So we had a fairly big story a couple of weeks ago about some American investors potentially investing in Norwich City, which is a massive story in terms of Norwich City perspective. They've been owned by the same people for 25 years, and even though it wasn't like they're going to take over story, it was still really significant, and kind of managed to source it exclusively and went through probably a week-long process of then trying to stand it up and try and make sure that the story's in a place then when you're really comfortable with it. So it's something that I think about a lot, because you can put out 10 stories that are correct. If you put out one that's wrong, that's the one people remember.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's not just you as well, it's the organisation that you represent, and that then feeds into it as well. And it's a massive problem, because as we've said, and you told the story at the start about your family, I don't watch the news, it's all negative, and it's all wrong or whatever, and people spin it because they've got agendas or political ideologies that they're trying to fulfil and whatnot. That's actually a really damaging position to be in.
It is,
and it's not, because ultimately it should be on the people who are in positions in journalism to tell the truth and to tell stories that are accurate and right, so people have information and a lot of the time can come to their own verdict. And I think we're in a position now where a lot of people are telling the verdict and not the facts.
No, not.
And actually our job is to tell the facts and not give the verdict a lot of the time. So it's incredibly important, and it is something that I think about a lot, and that kind of fake news element is really damaging, I think, to what is, I feel, the vast majority of journalists who are doing a very decent job, a very important job in all sectors, be it political, be it on crime, be it on local journalism, which I'm in, football, sports journalism, whatever the field. If you write a story, you have to make sure it's right, I think, and that's maybe it comes down to morals of a person, I don't know, but I don't think I could really sleep at night if I put out a story that I knew was wrong. So yeah, I think about it a lot, and I hope other people do as well in this profession.
So I don't think, I'd hope, well, I know it isn't true, but I'd hope that if you did want to enter this field, you wouldn't want to lie. Like, for me, it's probably because I'm a bit of a perfectionist and I overthink it. But if I want to put out a piece of work and be happy with what I produce, I wanted to make sure it is actually right. So I don't want to mislead people, because obviously we spoke about this before, but like the power of the media, that could influence something else, and if I do it in the wrong way, that could damage someone's reputation, like a company's reputation, or like my own reputation as well. Because if, like you said, if you do one story which is found out to have a flaw in, then the rest of your work is not going to be as acknowledged as high as it could. But it's also clear how big of a role like football plays in your life, just like hockey in mine, even though they are kind of similar, but not really. But would there be any other sports you'd like to have a report on or have a taste in?
Cricket is my other big love. Well, I say big love, it's a love. Really like cricket. I don't actually mind tennis, but I must admit I'm kind of like, I tune in for Wimbledon, and I should watch more of it, but a lot of it I don't. So they're the main two. I've actually kind of thought for a long time, if I didn't do football, I'd either probably do something with animals, or I'd probably try and do like political journalism, which is amazing, very different, very different. And it's also a minefield. So it's probably a lot easier to do football, and I think it's probably one of those things that will be a nice idea in my head for a long time. And like I say, I'm fortunate in a position where kind of you can write about certain issues within football, so that makes it a little bit easier. But I've become quite interested, I think, in the last few years about politics and what it looks like, and the people who are in charge and the people who are not in charge, and the general dynamics of it, and I find it really interesting. It's probably quite boring as well, so there's probably that element, and there's a bit of a geeky, nerdy sort of side to it that I quite like, and the mechanics of it. But so that would probably be the other one that I would put on. But I think for me, I feel most comfortable with football, because it's all I've known really. I kicked the ball from the moment I could kick a ball. I played football until I was 18, and then fell out of love with it a little bit in terms of from a playing perspective, and managed to kind of replace that love with what I'm doing now of writing and whatnot, and I got to a semi-decent level. I wasn't a brilliant footballer, but I got to a semi-decent level in the grand scheme of things that I was quite pleased with. But I was never good enough to be a professional, which obviously would have been my first
Yeah.
dream, but I was quite self-aware.
Yeah.
Back 12, I was like, yeah, this isn't going to
Not gonna
happen. I can't run. So yeah, I think it probably always will be football, unless something really shifts. But who knows? Maybe one day I'll view that nice idea of political journalism and think, yeah, I'll have a stab at it.
I think political journalism is obviously very complicated. Like, you can't say the wrong things or anything. But sports journalism, I don't know. I wouldn't be good at like football that much. Hockey I could probably do, but like I said, I wanted to keep playing it as more of a hobby. But for me, like, the most important, powerful, like, media representation of sport is the marathon every year. I don't know why, but like, when I actually went to it one year and I saw all the cameras and I saw the reporters like talking to different charities and stuff, and like when I watched it back, I just thought it was like so inspiring and stuff to like do all of that. But it's kind of like having to make people realise the importance of sports, because obviously football is very important. Like, everyone has their own teams, and I know there's like rivalry between teams like Man City, Man United and all of that, but I do think like the importance of sport has their own, you feel like you're a part of a collective, and like having people like you as journalists to portray it for everyone is quite important. But I feel like football does receive a lot of media coverage in comparison to other sports. Like, I know hockey is well known, but it's not as well known as football. Like, whenever you think of like Britain, you do think of football. But this is quite a question to make you think. But what would you picture in a world without journalism for sport and everything?
I think it would be a really dangerous one, to be completely honest, because, and I think, again, you can link this to football. I think it's really important to have that independent voice and that scrutiny. And again, not to link everything back to politics, which feels like what I'm doing in this, but if you think about it from a political perspective, it would be like having a government and no opposition. It's like there's no scrutiny, there's no one's putting anything under a microscope and going, hang on a minute, is that right? Is this right? What's the facts behind this? And I think it would be a more dangerous world if people weren't telling powerful stories, be it in football or any other field. And I think, again, to relate back to your very, very first question about football and the media, at the minute we're seeing a really interesting trend of clubs becoming more prominent with their own media outlets. And that's really interesting because, for example, if a football club loses 5-0 or the manager is under pressure or a player hasn't performed well, you get a very different type of interview with a club, which is essentially employee to employee, and there's a degree of, right, we have to get a positive message out here, even though we've lost 5-0 and whatever, had 4 men sent off. Whereas with us, or with kind of independent journalists, it's a very different line of questioning. It's probably more authentic. It's probably more probing. It's probably more accurate. It's probably the questions that people want to see answered, and that's how I go into interviews a lot of the time. It's and maybe it's a little bit easier than me because I also support the football club that I cover, and they're two really different hats to wear because I have to take off the supporter one quite a lot and put on the reporter one. But there are a lot of people who say you should just throw the supporter one away completely, it's irrelevant, but I actually think it's a really useful component to have to put on every so often, because I can say to myself, right, I'm speaking to this person, they might want to know why the season tickets have increased by 10% or whatever, and that's something that you're not going to get in a club interview or without journalism. And people don't get the answers to questions that need answering, and uncomfortable questions as well at times, let's be honest about that. And they create difficult conversations. So I think if we didn't have journalism in the world, we'd have a lot more dictatorships. We'd have a lot more people with a lot more power who shouldn't have that power. Maybe we do anyway. So I think it's a dangerous world, and probably you could probably look at a few countries in isolation and say, right, that's what the whole world would be like if we didn't have independent, honest, authentic journalism. I always link it back to like silence strengthens authority. So if you have no one like challenging what is going on, then obviously it's going to stay the same. But obviously for you, if you have that background of being in like a supporter of Norwich City for so long, you're going to know what the fans want to hear, and it's going to be more authentic, because obviously people are going to listen to media if they hear what they want to hear. They're not going to listen to something which is all run by someone else. But do you think you have to
are the reactions and the interviews you have to do very different when it's a win or a loss? Like, can you tell the difference?
Yes. Yeah. People are much more willing to speak to you after a win. You tend to find, and to be honest, it's been really interesting because in the role that I do now, which is a chief Norwich City, so it's a bit more senior, but essentially means my match day responsibilities have changed a little bit. So I'm now responsible after the game to go and speak to a player.
Yeah.
So we do that after every game, and there can be instances where you ask very difficult questions, and it's in a really strange environment because they've just played a game of football, so the emotion's still there. If they've lost, that competitiveness, that disappointment is still there. And so you have to ask difficult questions in a way that doesn't annoy them on a human level. And I'm probably self-aware enough to know that I've probably got that wrong on occasion. And I can think of one example where I asked a player a question that he took exception to, and he was fine about it in the end. But it was that initial kind of, what the hell are you asking that for?
Yeah, exactly.
Which is fine because it meant that I'd asked a difficult question. It was probably more the way that I asked it. I was probably a little bit too short with it, which again is fine. But sometimes you have to get better answers, you have to manage people as well as ask questions. So that's always a really interesting kind of perspective, because you need to be fair and critical, but you can't be personal, and you can't be overcritical, and you can't do it. I can't ask someone a question from a viewpoint of me being disappointed as a fan. I ask them a question from someone who's trying to get an answer as a journalist, and they're two really different things. It's completely different speaking to people after a win and speaking after a defeat. It's a much nicer experience for everyone if they win. But I always try and say that I think for me it's about authenticity, about what I do, and I try and say things as I see them, because I think if I gave out a false position or asked a question that I didn't really believe in, then I think ultimately that comes back and reflects, and the audience can see that or hear that when they listen to it or whatever. So they can be interesting, and they can be an interesting environment at times. And what we spoke about in kind of the kind of general inequality in them. So again, because it's a lot of male on male, you get a lot of masculinity and a lot of kind of people trying to be uber manly and stuff. Even within interviews and interview situations, you get people who try and intimidate you and whatnot. And sometimes you have to stand up to that. So it's a really interesting situation, and sometimes a really difficult situation as well, because you never know until they walk through the door which player you're going to get. So you can't really prep for it.
No, I feel like it's just having to adapt to the situation you're put in, because obviously if you play football, obviously I play hockey, like obviously we're not professionals, but we know how it feels to lose. Like for me, I play at Norwich Dragons, and Magpies and Harson are our enemy. They are the other rival, and if you win against them, you just feel on top of the world, and you're going to want to talk about it to people. You want to boast, you want to be happy about it, you want to be like, oh, we did this tactic, we did this. But if you lose, I've had games coming back in the car with my mum, I haven't talked. I'm just it's completely different to the different reactions, and obviously it's going to be the same with footballers. And obviously I'm not that educated on football, but there is obviously that stereotype of footballers sometimes being a bit violent or a bit angry after a game if they don't win. And obviously you have like the spectators, obviously you've got instances of quite bad football violence as well after a loss as well. So do you ever speak to the fans watching afterwards, and can you see the similarities in the reactions between the players and the spectators?
I think it probably depends which spectators you speak about, because a lot of football, and particularly a rise in not what I've seen firsthand, but there's certainly been reports this year that there's a lot more kind of drug-fueled football spectators, which is a problem, and a problem that football needs to address. And it's kind of, I think everyone if you don't watch football, you kind of view football fans as this kind of rabble of drunk people who are violent and abusive and racist and whatnot. And that's not the case from my experience. I actually think football fans and being in a football ground, it can be the most wonderful experience, because it can be a collective of people coming together as a community, and that kind of concept of community in a digital world is dying out quite a bit. So I think there's a degree of football fans being a little bit misunderstood, but then I'm biased because I am one, so I'm going to stick up for them somewhat. But there's definitely that issue. I think with a lot of players, and I think this is life really, you kind of get different personalities.
Definitely,
so you get people who are really angry after a defeat, and you also get people who are quite subdued, and I think there's a really important difference between two. And you also have footballers who can really articulate their feelings and talk about why they've lost or why certain things have happened, and other footballers can't do that. So and that's the same with human beings. So your response to a situation or a defeat or adversity might be completely different to mine. We might be able to communicate those in completely different ways if you caught us less than an hour after it happened, you know. Exactly. So that is kind of what I find fascinating, because whoever walks through that door, you know that you're going to kind of get a different experience, whoever it is. So it keeps you on your toes.
Yeah, it would, because you wouldn't know like what is to come. But I feel like people, like in our society today, we kind of always see failures as like a setback, but it's kind of quite important. Like obviously for me, I've had like many setbacks in like school, like sport, everything. But if you get me initially after it, at first I'm a bit like, I don't want to talk about it because I don't want to say the wrong thing in response. But I feel like it's just learning from that. And I think if footballers are shown to be like give actual like credit the other team or like congratulate them, but it's going to give a different perspective to footballers. And obviously you come at football with many different perspectives, like being a fan and then being a reporter. But was it quite a shock going from watching the game in the seats to like the press box? Was it a big difference?
Yeah, it's a big difference. You can't celebrate goals.
Can't you?
No. There's kind of this unwritten rule that you just don't, because obviously you're there impartially and in a professional capacity. I've had one instance. We were away at Newcastle, and we had there's a few Norwich fans among us. There's four of us that go to an away game, and we just hired this video. I'll name him Adam, who's our video guy. We're in Newcastle, and where press boxes are in away grounds, you're basically in with the home fans.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So even more reason why you can't celebrate really.
Yeah.
But Norwich scored, and he was sat next to me, and he did celebrate, just a fist bump, like that. Yeah. And I almost had to say, just calm, So there are instances where naturally you lose yourself in the game, and I think that's actually, and I still moan at referees. You never lose it. And then you go and watch it later and you go, they're probably right, actually. It's a completely different experience. And like I told you, the anecdote of missing a goal because you've got your head in a laptop, I almost have to watch football in a completely different way, because you have to look for structures and stories, and he's playing well, but why is he playing well? And that's not something you really do as a fan. It's where's the ball? Have we scored? Are we winning? And that's a completely different thing. So there are examples where Norwich will lose a game of football, but I think they've played really well. So I might tweet out, they've lost, but this in their performance was really good, and you can get like a dozen replies going, doesn't matter. And that's kind of where it's interesting, this dynamic, and also you can get times where they win and they play really badly, and you say that, and you can get criticised for that. So that's why I think honesty is important in my role, because I try and say things as I see them.
And you can never please everyone.
No, of course you can't. So it's a completely different experience. From the moment you walk in, you get there earlier than fans, so you often walk into an empty stadium. You're there long after they're gone as well, so you often arrive before them and leave after them. The interview process is very interesting, because you're kind of looking and walking past people that you walk past every week, so you kind of have to deal with that, and that's quite an interesting kind of perspective. So it is a different experience on the whole. I enjoy it, I think. Yeah,
I would, but I've never, like myself, been to a football game. But obviously, I've heard from people like the atmosphere of being in a crowd with everyone is obviously so amazing. And obviously, all you're bothered about is, have they scored? Is the ball going to our goal? But obviously, if you're in the press, like you said, you're going to be going, why do you do that? And obviously, you can't be seen to favour obviously too much on one team.
No.
But I feel like it's still, the power you have is still quite immense. Obviously people think that the most important person in the game of football is the actual players, but in reality you're showing what the fans actually want.
It's a lot of the narrative, isn't
it?
And you're kind of responsible for perpetuating them or constructing them or whatever. Or I know that if I write a story on something, that could then become a point of debate amongst supporters, and it's the same for my colleagues as well, and this is on a very small scale, because we're only local journalists. So if you imagine you're a national journalist writing about the England national team, and you say, actually, I don't think the manager's very good.
Yeah.
That's
very.
It's mad, really, and particularly because you can almost get, particularly in the field that I'm in, stuck in like a little bubble of it all. And I'm sure people do in other sort of reporting spectrums as well. You can kind of, it can be difficult to look outside that and look at what people think looking into your bubble when you're kind of stuck in it. That responsibility never really leaves you, and I think you kind of, it was something for me which was like wow, because I stepped in from it, as I said, from fan media, which isn't massively consumed, to suddenly actually know your voice holds weight now, and that's quite a big shift and quite a big responsibility to then move to. And a lot of people really struggle with it, and I struggled with it for a long time. But I think there's probably a reflection of actually when you become more comfortable within yourself, and that's professionally. I think that becomes maybe a little bit less of a burden, because when we spoke about reputations earlier, you begin to develop a bit of a reputation where maybe people want to listen to you, or people want to disagree with you, and that's fine as well. We spoke about the power of disagreeing, and I never write something for the whole aim of I want everyone to agree with me all the time, because as you said earlier, it's impossible.
It never happens.
But also that's not how debate really works.
No.
And if I came to a debate and said I think this, and you went I agree, brilliant.
Too boring.
We don't move on, and that's why I think particularly with other journalism, which is far more important than football journalism. If someone is talking about an issue and they have an opinion on an issue, it's really important to hear alternative voices and for people to say, actually, this piece was well constructed, it was good, I agree with these points, but this point I disagree with, and here's why. And this is kind of to move this on maybe to social media, where I kind of feel with social media is in a really interesting place, because you kind of get two fields of it, and I try and say this to people who are younger than me, because I've been there and I've seen it. When you write something, if someone responds to it with critique, you take it really personally. And you almost have to learn, as I said earlier, you have to learn how to criticise, and you have to learn how to get criticised.
How to take it yourself.
Because someone can go, I disagree with your point, and if you're 2 months into the job, you can take that really personally, because it feels like an attack on the character because you've written it. But often it's not. It's just someone disagrees with what you think. And other times you can get tweets that are just you're rubbish or whatever. You know? And I'm very fortunate that I don't get those a lot, and I wouldn't pretend to. But I've had them on occasion, as I'm sure most people have. And I think I've probably developed a bit of a thicker skin now, where I don't really care. But certainly with the constructive ones, I'm always, in many ways, more minded to respond to those ones than I am with people saying I 100% agree with you. Because ultimately that's why I write, I think, because I want people to offer their opinions, and you want to talk about stuff. It's a really interesting one, and I find it really interesting.
I think it's just being able to know that you aren't going to go into the job being the best. Like you are going to be able to want to be able to progress and improve. And it's like you said, like when you were a fan, you probably saw some tweets from people and gone, I don't agree with that. So that's what I mean. So when you go into it yourself and you see a response to something of, I don't agree with you, it's not a response on you. They're not going in and going, actually, that journalist is wrong.
And this is one of the big learning processes that I've had, because when I was at the start, you almost become petrified to have an opinion, because you don't want to be criticised for it. And eventually, I think you just have to kind of suck it up and develop thick skin and know that not everything's, some of it's personal. Some people are just saying it because they're jealous or they don't like you, and that's fine. But by the same token, a lot of people are just critiquing your work and critiquing some of the stuff you say, and that, I said, to go back to kind of our conversation on the art of disagreeing, that's actually really powerful, I think. And that's probably where professionally I've evolved from where I was 2 years ago when I took the job. And in that careers talk that I did with you guys, I spoke about how at the very start of my journey I sent loads of emails out to people with this very bad blog that in hindsight was terrible, and I sent out loads of emails, and what I really wanted back was people going, you're amazing, keep going. I got one reply and it didn't say that, and it was full of constructive criticism, and I didn't write again for a week because I took it really personally. And
you would vote.
You just want to hide under your bed sheets, and you don't want to come out, and you don't want to look at anyone, and you don't want to do it again, and that is a really interesting part that you have to develop as a person, and again, that's not just journalism. I think that's probably life as well.
Because for me, like one of my worst traits is that I'm just too much of a people pleaser. Like I just couldn't say no. And then obviously for me, what I've kind of adapted as an attitude is, if I don't ask, then I'll never know. So I've just like emailed loads of people, like I emailed you, emailed like loads of people, and just like, can I just get some experience? Just because if you don't ask, you never know. And like that's probably helped me the most. But I also think like last year when I wrote for the newspaper and I got criticism on my articles when I was just a writer, I'd kind of be a bit like, I really wanted them to like it. And obviously they did like it, but they're not going to like all of it. And now that I'm coming at this year's like publication as an editor, I'm going, actually, the editors do all love the articles. We're just showing you what we think to make you better. Like we don't want to critique you. We want to show you like what to help to get you better. And I think it's just as a society we see criticism as an attack on ourselves.
But I see it now. I see people, and this again very pertinent to football. I've encountered people, and not just at Norwich, in other football clubs as well, and even playing and even in other organisations and businesses who have really top level jobs. But don't know how to take criticism or really struggle with taking criticism, and kind of we've maybe found that with some of the stuff we've written around relegation that some people haven't liked it, and it's like, well,
it's the truth though.
It's what we think, it's what we feel, and we're just trying to represent the people who are out there, and sometimes that can be taken as personal, and I don't think it ever really is. And that's kind of a different angle on it. But you're right, and learning to be criticised is a very difficult thing, because within that is the process of being hurt, and also knowing how to process that, because I think you can either process that with anger, and I don't really do anger, to be a complete, it's a bit of a character flaw of mine, but the other side of that is you go in a shell, or actually you just come back and you try and learn from it and you try and adapt to it. And I think also you encounter people who are well-meaning, and those are the people you engage with on it, and those people who are just trying to be constructive and are probably just trying to help in a roundabout way, even if that doesn't seem at the time.
Yeah, it may not seem like it.
And I've encountered it before as well, and I've also encountered people who are just talking absolute nonsense. And sometimes you have to put those right as well. But if it's personal, then I often think that actually that's because they don't know how to argue, and they don't know how to criticise with what you're saying and your opinion. So you've almost won the argument then. Learning to be criticised, particularly in journalism, I think is really important, because you can write a story, particularly with football, which is so tribal. And people are like, they love their club. You get some people who won't hear a bad word said about their club, and to them it's like an additional family member. Actually, no, you can't poke fun at my little brother. You know, otherwise we're gonna have a problem. And so you have to recognise that as well. It's a really interesting dynamic, and that's something that I've learnt that now. And even when I get to a place where I think, okay, I'm comfortable with it now, I can get a tweet or I can get an email.
It's just one thing.
And then you sync again, and you have to do the whole process again. So even now, I say this not as someone who's fully there yet, but I think I've got a hell of a thicker skin than I did a couple of years ago. But that's not just from people consuming content, that can be from people you're writing about as well. So that's an interesting dynamic.
It's just a process of criticism. Like for me, I got like hockey, they put you into adults at the age of 15. So I go into it and I've got women like 3 times the age as me, and you have to just respond to it. Like they just say, just bite back. And at first I'm like, I can't bite back. Like they're gonna bite back even harder. But it's just like the process of criticism is hard. But once you learn how to take criticism, then you can like effectively criticise others and still know that it's alright. But if you could leave listeners with one final thought on the power of media and what they could do, what would you say?
I would say engage with it, read it, because it's important. It might not always be what you want to hear, but read reliable news sources. We're in a very difficult place as a society with news, and we kind of spoke about it earlier, with what's true and what's not. Read outlets that are reliable, that are accurate. Read a variety of stuff, read stuff you disagree with as well, because as we've spoken about, that's really powerful. But also, I think if you can get involved with it now, it's as easy as ever, because like we're doing, we've got a phone in the table and we're having a conversation, and you can create media in this way, so it's easier than ever to create media. And it's just about making sure you can add value to it, and if it's something you want to do, ultimately make sure you, as we've spoken about, you get into it for the right reasons, because you want to tell stories, and good stories. Know that it's a process, and that there's a lot of dark days and long days, and certainly for me, a lot of working on a laptop in the back of a car at 11 o'clock
Yeah.
at night and you contemplate what you're doing with your
Yeah.
life. But media is really important, and everyone should engage with it. And I tell my family this all the time. Some of whom, like yours, are like, can't read the news.
Yeah.
Too negative. Actually, no, engage with it.
Yeah,
Read
you
it.
should.
It's really important to be tuned in, even if you're not massive on really important issues,
Yeah.
or big on politics or big on current affairs, or you're not a massive news junkie. Just be in a position where you understand what's going on, because that's really important, and ultimately it's only the media that's going to tell us, I think, and sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes also it's a bad thing. So it's about balance probably more than anything else. So that's probably the message I would leave them with.
Yeah, because if you know how to engage with the media, then you're obviously going to know what you want to do in order to change it. But for me, it's the quote of like, when the world's silent, like one voice becomes powerful, and that one voice can be obviously like, I want to go into journalism in order to like give a voice to people, but you can't represent everyone, like we touched upon. There is always going to be criticism. You just need to try and reach a compromise, and some people don't like that compromise, but you're going to have to admit it to it. Thank you everyone for listening, and thanks again for coming onto the podcast to share the story.
No, thank you very much.
And make sure to keep on touch with you talking about football, even though I may not understand what's going on, but I'll still keep in touch.
I'm not sure I know what's going on a lot of the time.
No.
So.
Is there anything we can look forward to for the next football season?
Some wins, I hope.
Well, hopefully.
I hope so.
Yeah.
It should be a better season, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
So hopefully a little bit easier to report on than the last one.
Yeah, it should be alright. But thank you again for coming on, and remember to be a voice, not an echo. And I shall see you next time as we continue to discover another story and discover how they got to where they are.